After the mother's death, two babies fall into complete silence, rejecting food and affection. A calm nanny appears and, with simple gestures, breaks the emptiness of the house. But the arrival of an authoritarian grandmother threatens to undo the home that was reborn. Then an unexpected decision redefines what it truly means to be a family. The apartment on North Bayside Avenue in San Diego was once a place of laughter and plans. Now the cutting silence was only interrupted by the occasional muffled crying of two 18-month-old girls. Edward Morrison, 36, looked through the wide window that framed the Coronado Bridge in the distance, but his thoughts were elsewhere. 6 months had passed since Felicity had died in a tragic accident on the I-5 freeway. 6 months of an absence that seemed to swallow everything around him. The businessman adjusted his glasses, running a hand through his dark hair, already sprinkled with grey strands that hadn't been there before. His tech startup, Quantum Code, continued to function thanks to his partner and friend, Raphael, but Edward had almost completely withdrawn. How could he focus on codes and meetings when his twin daughters, Sophia and Beatrice, seemed to wither a little more each day? The sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. He walked slowly down the hallway, where photographs of happy moments still adorned the walls. Felicity holding the newborns in the hospital, the couple in Martha's Vineyard, everyone at the beach house in La Jolla Shores. Memories of a life that seemed to have happened in another existence. Mr. Morrison? I'm Amanda from the agency. I've come to get my things. The 5th nanny in 6 months. This one had lasted only 3 days. The girls just don't react to anything I do, the young woman explained, visibly frustrated as she collected her belongings. Even the doctors can't understand it. They barely eat. They don't look at anyone. It's as if they're somewhere else. Edward nodded, having heard versions of this same farewell many times. The best pediatricians in California, renowned child psychologists, specialists in early childhood grief. No one could reach the little ones who seemed to have completely shut down after their mother's departure. I understand your decision, Amanda. I appreciate your effort. After the nanny left, Edward returned to his daughter's room. In the carefully decorated room in pastel tones, with cloud and star mobiles hanging from the ceiling, the identical twins remained in their separate cribs, their large brown eyes fixed on undefined points. Beatrice, who had always been the more restless, now just held a small, expressionless stuffed rabbit. Sophia, the calmer one, kept her hands closed over the sheet, still as a small statue. "My little ones," Edward whispered, approaching. As usual, there was no reaction when he tried to touch Beatrice's curly brown hair. "Daddy's here." But was he really? Edward questioned himself daily, whether his physical presence was enough when his mind and heart seemed to have followed Felicity. The apartment had become just a setting, a stage where 3 survivors wandered between memories, unable to build something new. His cell phone rang. It was his secretary, Denise, who kept the most urgent matters running. "Edward, the caregiver agency contacted me. They said they have one last option to recommend. A young woman who wasn't on the initial list, but has experience with difficult cases. Denise, we've gone through 5 professionals already. Maybe it's better to consider Dr. Paul's suggestion to temporarily institutionalize the girls to—" "No." "Edward?" Denise interrupted, with the frankness of someone who had worked with him for 8 years. "The girls need their father and a home, not an institution. This young woman, Louisa Campbell, just returned to San Diego after some time in New York City. She studied pedagogy, specializing in therapeutic education. Please, just talk to her." Late that afternoon, the doorbell rang again. Edward opened the door without great expectations, finding a young woman of medium height. Dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, olive skin, and almond-shaped eyes that conveyed an unusual serenity. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Louisa Campbell." Her voice was calm and melodious. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you." Something about Louisa's presence was different. There wasn't that professional anxiety, nor the look of pity that Edward knew so well. During the brief interview in the living room, she listened more than she spoke, asking precise questions about the girls, their routines before and after the incident. "The twins have no physical problems," Edward explained, repeating the diagnosis of several doctors. "It's as if they built an invisible wall after—" "What happened?" Louisa nodded unhurriedly. "Mr. Morrison, when we lose someone fundamental, sometimes we forget how to continue existing. Adults have words for it. Even if insufficient, children so small do not. Their silence is a language in itself. Edward felt something strange, a small glimmer of hope he hadn't experienced in months. "Do you think you can help them?" "I can't promise results, only genuine presence," she replied honestly. "I can start tomorrow if you allow me." Edward led her to the twins' room. Unlike the other professionals who immediately tried to interact with the children, Louisa just stood at the door, observing. After a few moments, she approached silently, sat on the floor between the two cribs, and began to hum a Brazilian lullaby. She didn't look directly at the girls, nor did she try to touch them. She simply occupied the space with a light presence, as if saying, "I am here without haste, without demands." To Edward's surprise, the little ones didn't get agitated or cry, as they usually did with strangers. Sophia even turned her head slightly in the direction of the soft melody. It was a minimal movement, almost imperceptible, but for someone who had witnessed months of emotional immobility, it seemed like a miracle. "Louisa," Edward said later, when she was leaving, "the girls usually don't accept food from anyone but me, and even then it's a battle. Today they reacted to your presence. How—" She smiled slightly. "Children feel our energy. I'm here to be with them, not to fix them. The difference seems subtle, but it changes everything. I'll be here at 8 tomorrow if you agree." When he closed the door after Louisa left, Edward felt something different in the apartment. The silence was still there, but it seemed less dense, less definitive. That night, looking at Felicity's portrait on the bedside table, he whispered, maybe there is a way." For the first time in months, the twins slept through the night without nightmares. The next morning dawned with a fine drizzle, typical of a San Diego winter. Edward had slept only a few hours, tormented by the mix of hope and skepticism that Louisa's visit had awakened. At 7:50, the doorbell rang punctually. Louisa Campbell entered carrying a small backpack and a tranquil demeanor that contrasted with the heavy atmosphere of the apartment. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she greeted, removing her rain-damp coat. "How was your night?" "Surprisingly well," he admitted, leading her to the kitchen. The girls slept without interruptions, a rarity in recent months. The spacious kitchen, with its ocean view, bore the traces of Felicity's personality. Portuguese tiles she herself had chosen, herbs grown in small pots on the window, handwritten recipes tacked to the refrigerator. Edward made coffee while explaining the routine, or what was left of it. Beatrice used to wake up always hungry, Sophia more sleepy. Now both just lie there staring at the ceiling. Dr. Rodriguez says it's a type of emotional regression. His voice carried the weight of someone who had repeated that information to countless professionals without results. Louisa listened attentively while organizing some items she had brought. Children understand much more than they can express. "Mr. Morrison, their absence is also a form of presence. They are here, feeling, processing in their own way." Edward watched her prepare 2 small bottles with a specific technique. "Warm milk, not hot," she explained. "And vanilla essence, just a drop. It stimulates positive olfactory memories." When they entered the room, the twins were awake in their usual state of detachment. Louisa didn't immediately try to attract their attention. She placed the bottles on the dresser, lightly opened the curtains to let in some natural light, and sat down again between the cribs, in the same spot as the day before. "Good morning, Sophia." "Good morning, Beatrice," she said softly, not expecting a reply. "It's good to see you both again." She then began to narrate a simple story about a little bird that built its nest even on rainy days. Her melodious voice filled the room without being invasive. Edward, observing from the door, noticed that Sophia's eyes occasionally followed the movement of Louisa's hands as she illustrated parts of the story with gentle gestures. After a few minutes, Louisa picked up the bottles and offered them simultaneously, one in each hand without insistence. To Edward's astonishment, both girls accepted, slowly sucking the contents while keeping their eyes fixed on Louisa. "They're eating without resistance," Edward whispered, fearing he would break the spell of that moment. Louisa just smiled, continuing the story of the little bird while the little ones ate. When they finished, she picked them up one by one with deliberately slow movements, placing them on her lap on the soft rug. The twins didn't protest, a miracle in itself. Throughout the rest of the morning, Edward alternated between observing from a distance and trying to work remotely in his office. Each time he returned to peek, he found a slightly different picture. Louisa showing brightly colored illustrated books, singing children's songs with gestures, or simply sitting in silence near the girls, respecting their space while offering her constant presence. At lunchtime, to Edward's renewed astonishment, the twins ate almost all the baby food prepared by Louisa, mashed potatoes with carrots and a touch of olive oil. "How did you manage this in just one morning?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "We tried everything. Pediatricians, child nutritionists, even that eating disorder specialist from New York City." Louisa calmly organized the used dishes. "It's not about technique, Mr. Morrison. It's about trust. Children feel when we're anxious for results, when we see them as problems to be solved. They need to feel that they are accepted exactly as they are." Edward swallowed hard, struck by the truth in those words. How many times had he himself looked at his daughters with despair, seeing them as painful reminders of what he had lost, or as overwhelming responsibilities he didn't know how to manage? In the afternoon, Louisa took the twins to the glass-enclosed balcony, where the rain created hypnotic patterns on the glass. She placed them on a large rug with cushions and began to present small, colorful objects, soft balls, textured cubes, gentle rattles. She didn't force interaction, she just made the toys available in the space between them. It was then that it happened. Beatrice reached out her little hand towards a red ball. The movement was hesitant, almost imperceptible, but her tiny fingers closed around the object. Louisa didn't make a fuss. She just smiled and continued her soft song. Edward, who was watching from the doorway, felt his eyes well up. It was Beatrice's first spontaneous movement in months that wasn't crying or resistance. Late that afternoon, when the twins finally fell asleep after a warm bath, Edward invited Louisa for a conversation in the living room. "I need to understand better who you are," he said, pouring tea for both of them. "What the agency told me is that you worked in New York City with special education, but recently returned to San Diego." Louisa nodded, holding the cup between her hands as if seeking its warmth. "I graduated in pedagogy from UCSD with a specialization in therapeutic education from Columbia University. I worked for 5 years in New York City, mainly with children in traumatic situations." She paused as if choosing her next words. "I returned to San Diego 2 months ago, after a difficult period." Edward sensed there was more to that story, but he respected the young woman's space. After all, he too carried silences he wasn't ready to share. "What do you see when you look at my daughters?" he finally asked. "I see 2 courageous children who found the only way they know to deal with too much pain," Louisa replied, without hesitation. "They're not broken, Mr. Morrison. They're protecting themselves the best way they can." Edward let out a deep sigh. "And what about me? What do you see?" Louisa's dark eyes met his with an intensity that surprised him. "I see someone trying to breathe underwater, surviving but not living. Your daughters feel that too." The frankness hit Edward like a physical blow. She was the first person who spoke to him, not as a widower worthy of pity or an overwhelmed father, but as someone capable of facing difficult truths. "They deserve more than that," he admitted, lowering his gaze. "Yes, and so do you." Louisa placed her cup on the table. "If you allow me, I would like to continue working with your daughters, not as a temporary solution, but as a true commitment. How long do you think it will take to—" "I don't think in terms of deadlines, Mr. Morrison. Emotional recovery doesn't follow schedules. It can take weeks, months. The important thing is consistency." He nodded, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "So you officially accept the job? Not as a temporary substitute, but as my daughter's nanny." Louisa smiled, a delicate smile that lit up her eyes. "I accept. And if I may suggest, perhaps you could start participating more actively in activities with them. Your presence is irreplaceable." That night, after Louisa left, promising to return the next morning, Edward silently entered his daughter's room. Both slept peacefully, their little faces relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in months. On the impulse of the moment, he lay down on the floor between the 2 cribs, exactly where Louisa had been sitting. Looking at the ceiling where luminous stars formed constellations, he allowed himself for the first time since the tragedy to cry openly. "Help me be here for them," he whispered into the silence. "Teach me to breathe again." The following weeks brought subtle but profound changes to the apartment on North Bayside Avenue. Like persistent drops that slowly fill a vase, Louisa's daily presence gradually transformed the environment. The first month passed at its own pace, marked by small victories that seemed like miracles after such a long time of stagnation. On the 20th day, Beatrice held Louisa's finger for almost a full minute, looking directly into her eyes. On the 23rd, Sophia emitted a murmur that vaguely resembled the melody Louisa always sang during bath time. In the 4th week, both began to respond to their names, turning their heads slightly when called. Edward, initially a cautious observer, gradually participated more in his daughters' daily lives. Following Louisa's guidance, he began taking on small tasks, holding bottles during a feeding, reading bedtime stories, participating in games on the balcony when the afternoon sun bathed the apartment. "Don't force smiles," Louisa advised one morning, when she caught him trying to seem more cheerful than he really was. "Children don't need perfection, just authenticity. They know when we're pretending." That observation changed something fundamental in Edward. The permission to be imperfect, to be present even when it hurt, opened space for genuine moments with his daughters. One particularly difficult afternoon, when the longing for felicity hit him with unusual force, he simply sat on the colorful rug next to the girls and said, in a choked voice, "Daddy is sad today. But even so, I love you two very much." To his surprise, Beatrice crawled to him and rested her little head on his knee for a few seconds, the first spontaneous gesture of affection in almost 8 months. On a sunny September morning, as Edward was having coffee in the kitchen before an important video conference, he heard something that made his heart stop: laughter. Children's laughter came from the girls' room. He ran down the hallway and stopped at the door, witnessing a scene he would never forget. Louisa gently swayed a giraffe puppet, making it talk to the twins, who reacted with small smiles and joyful sounds. "They're laughing," Edward whispered, leaning against the doorframe so as not to fall. Louisa turned to him with shining eyes. "Yes, they're coming back to us." From that day on, progress accelerated. The girls began to show preferences. Beatrice leaned more towards books with animals, while Sophia preferred colorful blocks. They started accepting solid food more frequently, sleeping better, interacting not only with Louisa, but also with Edward. For the first time, the businessman asked Raphael to completely take over the company's external commitments for another 2 weeks, so he could focus entirely on his daughter's recovery. His partner, who had been following the situation closely, immediately agreed. "You're finally coming back, my friend," Raphael said during a phone call. "Your voice sounds different." On afternoons when it didn't rain, Louisa took the girls to the small park near the building. At first they just sat watching other children. Gradually they began to explore the space, touching the grass, feeling the texture of the sand, observing butterflies and ants with renewed curiosity. On one of these afternoons, while the twins played under Louisa's watchful eye, Edward received an unexpected call. "Son, we're thinking of visiting you next weekend," announced his mother, Cecilia. "Your father misses his granddaughters, and I want to meet this young woman who has been doing miracles with the girls. Denise told us everything." Edward smiled into the phone. His parents, who lived in Los Angeles, had respected his request for space during the worst months, limiting themselves to weekly calls. The idea of receiving them now seemed natural, even welcome. At dinner that day, after the twins were put to bed, Edward invited Louisa to stay a little longer. "My parents are coming next weekend," he commented, as they served themselves lasagna he had prepared. "They're curious to meet the person responsible for their granddaughter's transformation." Louisa smiled, but Edward noticed a brief flash of apprehension in her eyes. "You don't need to be nervous. They are simple and welcoming people." "I'm not nervous about that," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "It's just that being with families is still complex for me." It was the first time Louisa hinted at something about her own story. Edward didn't press but offered space for her to continue if she wished. "When I was 17, I took care of my younger brother Matthew," Louisa recounted after a moment of silence. "Our parents died in an accident on Interstate 5, and it was just the two of us. He was 6 years old." Edward felt a lump in his throat. Suddenly, Louisa's sensitivity with the twins took on a new meaning. That must have been extremely difficult. It was. I got a full scholarship to college, worked part-time and took care of him with all the love I could. Matthew was a brilliant boy, full of life. Her voice choked slightly. At 15, he was diagnosed with a rare heart condition. We fought for 3 years between hospitals and treatments. In the end, we couldn't win. Edward reached across the table, gently touching Louisa's fingers. I'm so sorry, truly. After that, I continued working with children in New York City, but it became increasingly difficult. Every little face reminded me of him. When the pain became unbearable, I decided to return to San Diego to start over. I was away from education when the agency called me about your daughters. Louisa looked up, her eyes now moist. Something told me I needed to try. At that moment, Edward saw Louisa completely, not just the competent professional who had saved his daughters, but the woman who knew the pain of loss firsthand. The silence that settled between them was filled with mutual understanding, with a profound recognition. You saved my daughters, he said finally, and I think you're saving me too. The weekend with Edward's parents was surprisingly harmonious. Cecilia and Anthony were charmed by Louisa, and more importantly by their granddaughter's visible progress. The girls, still shy but responsive, allowed their grandparents hugs and affection, something unthinkable months earlier. On Sunday night, after Edward's parents left, Louisa was preparing to go home when he invited her for a chat on the balcony. The night was especially clear, with the moon illuminating San Diego Bay in silvery tones. I've been thinking, Edward began, that perhaps it's time to consider more significant changes. Louisa looked at him questioningly. The contract with the agency expires in 2 weeks. I'd like to propose something different. I want to hire you directly, full-time, with better conditions. The girls need you and I. He paused. I've also discovered that your presence brought something I didn't think was possible anymore. Peace. Louisa's eyes reflected the moonlight as she considered the proposal. I've grown deeply attached to Sophia and Beatrice, she admitted, and I confess that this apartment has become more of a home to me in recent months than any other place. She took a deep breath. I accept your proposal, Edward, with one condition. What would that be? That you promise to continue the path you've started, to be present for your daughters, even when it's difficult, to allow yourself to live again, little by little. Edward extended his hand, which Louisa accepted in a firm clasp that sealed more than a professional agreement. It was a shared commitment to rebuilding shattered lives. In the following weeks, the apartment gained colors and sounds that had long been dormant. Edward hired a company to renovate some rooms. The girls' room received a new coat of paint in cheerful tones. The living room gained colorful cushions and plants that brought life to the spaces. Louisa, now officially the twins' governess and educator, made small contributions that made a big difference. Carefully selected books, educational toys, music that filled the house during the day. One October afternoon, as Edward worked in his office with the door ajar, he heard Beatrice clearly babble, "Lulu," her attempt to say, "Louisa." Minutes later, Sophia repeated the same sound. It was the first recognizable word from both of them since they had fallen silent after their mother's loss. "They're talking," Edward stated, emotional when he found Louisa in the playroom. "They're finding their voice again," she gently corrected. "And you too, Edward, you too." November arrived with the increasing warmth that heralded the San Diego summer. The apartment on North Bayside Avenue, which had long been plunged into emotional shadows, now breathed new energy. The twins, who would turn 2 next month, ran through the rooms with still uncertain but determined steps. Their vocabularies, previously non-existent, now included simple words, Dada for Edward, Lulu for Louisa, water, no more, small sonic miracles that filled the house. Edward had partially resumed his activities at Quantum Code, alternating between remote work and occasional visits to the office at the Innovation Hub. His presence at board meetings had caused positive commotion among employees, who for months had only seen his shadow in decisions made remotely. Raphael joked that he looked 10 years younger, an exaggeration certainly, but not without foundation. Something had changed in his demeanor, as if a long-extinguished light had been rekindled, still shy but present. Louisa, for her part, had established a structured routine that combined daily care with age-appropriate pedagogical stimuli for the girls. Every morning after breakfast, she conducted sensory activities, homemade Play-Doh, finger-painting boxes with different textures. Afternoons were for outdoor exploration, with walks in the park or play in the small inflatable pool she had set up on the balcony. Before bed there was always story time, when Edward frequently joined them, his deep voice bringing to life characters that made his daughters smile. It was precisely during one of these reading sessions, with Edward sitting on the bedroom rug, Beatrice and Sophia nestled in his lap as he narrated the adventures of a sea turtle, that the doorbell rang insistently. Louisa, who was organizing clothes in the adjoining closet, offered to answer it. "Continue the story, you're in a special moment," she said, smiling at the family scene. Upon opening the door, Louisa was met by a woman of approximately 60, with impeccably styled grey hair, wearing a navy silk ensemble and carrying a designer handbag. Her austere gaze swept over Louisa from head to toe before she even spoke. "Who are you? Where is my son-in-law?" The authoritative voice and the term son-in-law were enough for Louisa to identify the visitor. Mrs. Teresa Albright, Felicity's mother, whom Edward had mentioned a few times, always with a tense expression. "Good evening, madam. I'm Louisa Campbell, the girls' educator. Mr. Morrison is with them at the moment. May I announce your visit?" Teresa ignored the formality, entering without invitation. "I don't need to be announced in my daughter's house," she declared, placing her bag on the hall console as if marking territory. "Where are my granddaughters?" Louisa maintained her composure despite the rudeness. "They're in their room with their father, having story time before bed. I can take you there." Teresa followed Louisa down the hallway, her high heels marking the wooden floor like small sentences. When they reached the door of the children's room, the scene they found was one of absolute intimacy. Edward, now lying on the rug, was making different voices for each character in the story, while Beatrice tried to imitate the sound of a whale and Sophia clapped awkwardly. "So this is how my granddaughter's education is going, lying on the floor like savages." Teresa's cutting voice shattered the moment. Edward sat up abruptly, while the girls, startled by the interruption and the unfamiliar presence, clung to their father. "Teresa, I wasn't expecting your visit." Edward's voice instantly took on a formality Louisa had never heard before. "Evidently," the woman replied, advancing to the center of the room, "after 6 months of ignoring my phone calls and replying to my messages with monosyllables, I thought a surprise visit was necessary to see what conditions my granddaughters are living in." Her eyes swept the room, pausing on details. The colorful drawings tacked to the walls, made by Louisa with the girls, the handmade mobiles hanging, also created by them, the educational toys scattered on the rug. "And who is this young woman?" "Another temporary nanny, I suppose. Denise mentioned you've gone through 5 of them." Edward stood up, holding the girls, one in each arm. Both hid their faces in his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the hostile energy emanating from their grandmother. "Louisa is the girls' educator, Teresa. She's been with us for almost 3 months and has been fundamental to Beatrice and Sophia's progress." Teresa approached, extending her arms towards her granddaughters. "Come with Grandma, dears." The twins, instead of accepting the invitation, clung even more tightly to their father, almost in a panic. Teresa recoiled, visibly offended. "I see they don't even recognize me anymore. What have you been doing to them, Edward? Why are they rejecting me like this?" Edward took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "They've been through a very difficult period, Teresa. They're just starting to open up again. They need time to get used to people they haven't seen in months." "People? I'm their grandmother, the only true link left to my daughter." Teresa's voice choked briefly, the first crack in her authoritative facade. Louisa, sensing the rising tension, gently intervened. "Mr. Morrison, the girls are getting agitated. Perhaps it would be better to finish their routine while you talk with Mrs. Albright in the living room." Edward nodded, grateful for the sensible suggestion. He handed the girls to Louisa, who immediately began softly singing the lullaby she used to calm them. Teresa observed the interaction with narrowed eyes. "Let's go to the living room, Teresa," Edward indicated the way. "We can talk better there." In the spacious living room, Teresa occupied the main armchair as if it were a throne, refusing the offer of coffee or water. "I'm disappointed, Edward. Deeply disappointed. I thought your period of isolation was temporary, that eventually you would come to your senses and allow me to take a more active role in raising my granddaughters." Edward sat opposite her, rubbing his face in a gesture of weariness. "Teresa, I've always respected your grief. Felicity was your only daughter. I understand how devastating her loss was for you. That's precisely why. You should have sought me out. Who better to help the girls keep their mother's memory alive? You withdrew, Teresa. After the funeral, you yourself said you needed time, that seeing the girls was too painful. I respected your decision." Teresa adjusted herself in the armchair, recomposing her posture. "It was a moment of fragility. I've overcome that. Now I'm here, and I see that the situation is completely out of control. Who exactly is this young woman who seems to have taken over the house? My granddaughters? Louisa is a qualified professional who managed to reach Sophia and Beatrice when no one else could. She brought them back to life." Teresa let out a sound of contempt. "Qualified? A stranger hired by some agency? What do we know about her? Her family, her background?" Edward's growing irritation was visible in his tense jaw. "I know everything I need to know about Louisa. I trust her completely." "Trust? Like you trusted that investor who almost bankrupted your company last year, or the architects who delayed the apartment renovation by 6 months before the girls were born. You've always been naive, Edward." Felicity was the one with discernment in the relationship. The mention of his wife's name in that context hit Edward like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Teresa continued, "I see changes everywhere. Different paintings, new furniture, objects Felicity would never approve of. Are you systematically erasing her traces?" "Doris, I'm trying to create a healthy environment for our daughters, Teresa, a place where they can grow without being suffocated by grief." Teresa stood up abruptly, pacing the room with firm steps. "Healthy environment? Edward, your daughters were in a catatonic state just a few months ago. You yourself were on the verge of an emotional collapse, and now you're trying to convince me that everything is fine because you hired a governess who seems to have taken on the role of mistress of the house." At that moment, Louisa appeared discreetly at the door. "Excuse me. The girls are asleep now. If you'll allow me, I'll withdraw so you can continue your conversation privately." "Stay, Louisa," Edward asked to Teresa's surprise. "This discussion concerns you, too." Teresa stared at Louisa with an icy gaze. "Indeed it does. What are your intentions, Miss Campbell?" A young single woman working full-time in the home of a rich, vulnerable widower. It wouldn't be the first time we've seen this script. Louisa paled slightly but maintained her composure. "Mrs. Albright, I understand your concern for your granddaughter's well-being. I am here solely as an educator. My commitment is to Sophia and Beatrice's healthy development." "Spare me the pedagogical rhetoric," Teresa cut in. "I've seen how you move in this house, as if you're already part of the family. I've seen how my granddaughters call you Lulu, while barely recognizing their own grandmother." Edward stood up, unable to contain himself any longer. "Enough, Teresa. You cannot appear after months of absence and question the decisions I've made to save my daughters. Louisa brought light back into our lives when we were drowning in darkness. She deserves respect, not baseless accusations." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Teresa collected her bag with calculated movements. "I see you are under an influence that clouds your judgment. Very well. I had hoped we could resolve this as adults, but you leave me no choice." "What do you mean by that?" Teresa walked to the door, turning one last time before leaving. "You will hear from my lawyer. As their maternal grandmother, I have rights, and I will assert those rights for the good of my granddaughters." The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded more threatening than a violent slam. Edward collapsed onto the sofa, covering his face with his hands. "She's going to file for custody," he murmured, his voice choked with fear and anger. "I know, Teresa. She doesn't make empty threats." Louisa sat beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm sorry I caused this conflict. Perhaps it would be better if I stepped away for a while until—" "No," Edward interrupted, gripping her hand firmly. You are exactly what my daughters need right now. What all of us need." Their eyes met in a moment of silent understanding. Outside, the city lights reflected on the bay, while dark clouds gathered on the horizon, foreshadowing a storm. The court summons arrived on the first Tuesday of December, like an intruder wrapped in letterhead and legal terminology. Edward was not surprised. He knew Mrs. Teresa Albright's determination well. What shook him was the speed and aggressiveness of the text. Allegations of emotionally unstable environment, inadequate replacement of the maternal figure, and deterioration of legitimate family ties jumped from the pages like poisonous accusations. "She's asking for full custody of the girls," Edward explained to Louisa, as they both sat at the kitchen table after the twins had fallen asleep. "Based on the allegation that I am emotionally unstable and unable to provide an adequate environment." Louisa observed Edward's pale face, noticing the dark circles under his eyes that had returned after months of gradual improvement. "What's the next step?" she asked, keeping her voice calm despite the internal storm she felt. "I've already contacted Dr. Helen, my lawyer. She says it's a complex case. Teresa has considerable resources and significant social influence." Edward ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Louisa had learned to recognize as a sign of extreme anxiety. "On the other hand, we have in our favor the fact that the girls are visibly well and progressing, and the fact that you are a loving and present father," Louisa added firmly. A sad smile crossed Edward's face. "I wasn't always. In the first months after we lost Felicity, I was physically present but absent in every other aspect. Teresa has medical documents from that period, psychological evaluations that don't favor me. That was before. You've changed. The girls have changed. Anyone who observes you now will see that." The determination in Louisa's eyes brought Edward brief comfort. In the following days, the apartment's routine remained seemingly normal. The twins continued with their progress, oblivious to the legal storm brewing. Beatrice had started to construct small two-word phrases, like "want water" or "more story." Sophia, always more observant, showed a surprising ability to follow simple instructions and imitate Louisa's gestures during songs. However, beneath the surface of normalcy, a growing tension lingered. Meetings with lawyers interspersed with visits from social workers appointed by the court. Edward was constantly on the phone in his office, the door closed to shield the girls from conversations laden with terms like psychological assessment and parental competency evaluation. On a particularly difficult Thursday, after an extensive meeting with Dr. Helen, Edward found Louisa on the balcony, watching the sunset while the twins played with colorful blocks. It wasn't an encouraging meeting, he confessed, sitting heavily in a nearby chair. Teresa gathered testimonies from the previous nannies, all describing the girls' state and my behavior during the worst moments. The preliminary social workers report raises concerns about the long-term stability of the family environment. Louisa nodded, processing the information. "And what about my role in all this?" "I imagine my presence is one of the central points of Teresa's allegations." "It is," Edward confirmed, his voice betraying exhaustion. "Teresa is arguing that the girls developed an inappropriate attachment to you, that you would be usurping Felicity's place in the family. There are insinuations," he hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, "insinuations about the nature of our relationship." Louisa's cheeks flushed slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Our relationship is professional. Any impartial observer will see that." Edward held her gaze for a prolonged moment before responding. "Yes, it is professional," he agreed, although something in his intonation suggested a greater complexity behind that statement. The following Monday brought a new development. The judge assigned to the case, Judge Marianne Foster, ordered an official assessment of the home environment by a court-appointed special advocate. The visit would be on Wednesday without specific time notice to evaluate the family routine in its natural state. "It's a test," Dr. Helen explained over the phone. "They want to see how the house dynamic works, without prior preparation. Be authentic, Edward. Don't try to impress. That always comes across as artificial." When he hung up, Edward found Louisa organizing toys in the living room. "The advocate will be here on Wednesday." "Surprise assessment." "I understand," she replied, keeping her hands busy with small building blocks. "Edward, Regardless of what happens, I want you to know that I will always put the girls' well-being first. If at any point my presence becomes an obstacle for you to maintain their custody—" "No," he interrupted vehemently. "We are not even going to consider that possibility. You are part of the solution, not the problem. The girls need you. He stopped himself as if about to say something more personal, but reconsidered. "All of us need you." Wednesday dawned with a light rain, typical of a San Diego summer. The routine followed normally. Breakfast with the girls, Edward working in his office with the door open to hear his daughters, Louisa conducting educational activities in the playroom. Around 10:30, the doorbell. Rank Louisa answered the door, finding a middle-aged woman with short grey hair and a neutral expression, carrying a discreet folder. "Good morning. I'm Vera Miller, court-appointed special advocate from the San Diego Family Court. I'm here for the home assessment in the Morrison case." Louisa maintained her composure, inviting her in. "Good morning, Ms. Miller. I'm Louisa Campbell, the twins' educator. Mr. Morrison is in his office. May I call him, or would you like to see the premises first?" "I prefer to start by observing the normal routine. Please continue your activities as if I weren't here." Edward appeared in the hallway, having heard the doorbell. "Ms. Miller, welcome." "I'm Edward Morrison." The advocate greeted him with professional formality, explaining that she would spend approximately 2 hours observing the family dynamic and the conditions of the residents, as well as conducting brief individual interviews. During the following hours, Vera meticulously observed every interaction, every space. She saw Louisa conducting a sensory activity with the twins, using colored kinetic sand. She watched Edward interrupt his work to have lunch with his daughters, patiently helping them hold their adapted cutlery. She noticed how the girls communicated, not only with still limited words, but through gestures, expressions, and a unique language that the adults seemed to intuitively understand. "Beatrice is always the first to want to explore new things," Edward explained when the advocate commented on the difference between the twins. "Sophia observes first, analyzes, then decides whether to participate. It's always been like that, even before." The sentence hung in the air, the before lingering like an invisible dividing line between two lives. After lunch, while Louisa accompanied the girls during their nap, Vera conducted a brief interview with Edward in his office. "Mr. Morrison, how would you describe your daughter's current emotional state compared to 6 months ago?" Edward reflected before answering. "It's as if they've slowly returned from a very distant place. 6 months ago, they barely recognized my presence. They refused to eat, to interact, to make any prolonged eye contact. Now," his voice choked slightly, "now they run to me when I come home. They ask for stories. They laugh. Most importantly, they trust again. And Miss Campbell's role in this transformation? Fundamental. Louisa managed to reach them when no one else could. She has a background in pedagogy and experience with traumatized children. But beyond her technical qualifications, she has something more important: genuine sensitivity." The girls noticed that immediately. Vera made notes without expressing a reaction. "The children's grandmother, Mrs. Teresa Albright, alleges that you deliberately alienated her from her granddaughters and allowed a stranger to assume the role that should be hers." Edward visibly tensed. "Teresa withdrew voluntarily after Felicity's funeral. She said she needed time, that seeing the girls was too painful. I respected her decision. When she finally reappeared, months later, the twins had already established a routine with Louisa. Teresa demanded a position she didn't build, a bond she didn't cultivate during the most critical period. Later, while Edward played with the twins on the living room rug, Vera briefly interviewed Louisa in the kitchen. "Miss Campbell, what is your professional background?" "I have a degree in pedagogy from UCSD, with a specialization in therapeutic education from Columbia University. I worked for 5 years in New York City with children in situations of emotional vulnerability, especially cases of early trauma." "Why did you leave New York City?" Louisa hesitated, deciding on honesty. "I lost my younger brother, whom I raised since he was 6 after our parents passed away. The pain made it difficult to continue working with children there, where every place reminded me of him. I returned to San Diego to start over." "And how did you come to this specific house?" "The caregiver agency contacted me. Initially, I refused. I didn't feel ready to work with children again. But when I heard about the twins' situation, something changed. I felt I needed to try. Vera observed her with intensity. Mrs. Albright suggests that your intentions go beyond professional, that you might be seeking to establish yourself as a maternal substitute, possibly with interests in Mr. Morrison's estate. Louisa straightened up, her gaze meeting the advocate's without hesitation. My only intention is to contribute to Sophia and Beatrice's well-being. They lost their mother tragically and responded with the only defense mechanism they knew, withdrawal. My job is to help them trust the world again, to find emotional security. As for Mr. Morrison, our relationship is strictly professional. The advocate made a final set of notes before returning to the living room. It was then that it happened. Beatrice, who was playing with blocks on the rug, stood up on her still unsteady feet, tottered over to Edward, who was nearby, and for the first time said clearly, "Dada story." Dada. Edward's face lit up with indescribable emotion. It was the first time Beatrice had called him Dada since they had lost Felicity. Sophia, watching her sister, repeated the words, extending her arms towards her father. Vera Miller observed the scene in silence, her neutral expression softening slightly. She made one last note on her clipboard before concluding the visit. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Morrison, Miss Campbell. My report will be forwarded to Judge Marianne Foster by the end of the week." When the door closed after the advocate left, Edward and Louisa exchanged glances laden with cautious hope. Beatrice, oblivious to the importance of the moment she had just starred in, insistently tugged at her father's pants, repeating, "Story. Dada story." The week between the advocate's visit and the preliminary hearing was marked by a silent anxiety that hung over the apartment like fog over the bay. Edward alternated between moments of cautious optimism, especially when the twins showed new progress, and periods of intense worry, usually after long phone conversations with his lawyer. Vera Miller's report had been delivered to the judge, but its content remained confidential until the hearing. This informational limbo fed everyone's insecurity, despite efforts to keep the children's routine unchanged. "We need to prepare for all possible scenarios," Edward commented the night before the hearing, as he and Louisa organized toys in the living room after the twins had fallen asleep. Louisa nodded, putting colorful blocks into a wooden box. "What does Dr. Helen suggest?" "She says the fact that the girls are visibly well is our strongest argument. Their progression in recent months is unquestionable." Edward paused, holding a small teddy bear that had belonged to Felicity in childhood. "But Teresa has considerable resources and hired one of the most influential law firms in California. Furthermore, she is Felicity's mother. That blood tie carries a lot of weight in custody cases." "And what about me?" Louisa asked directly. "I'm a central point in her argument, aren't I?" Edward hesitated before confirming. "Teresa is building a narrative where you are presented as an opportunistic intruder who took advantage of a moment of family fragility. In her version, I am too emotionally vulnerable to realize that I am being manipulated." A heavy silence settled between them. Finally, Louisa looked up, meeting Edward's eyes. "If my presence is complicating your fight for the girls' custody, perhaps we should consider—" "No," Edward interrupted firmly. "We're not even going to start that conversation. You are the reason my daughters are living again, Louisa. The three of us need you." The intensity in his voice surprised them both. For a fleeting moment, something indefinable hung in the air between them. Something that went beyond gratitude or professional respect. Something neither of them was ready to name. "Then we will fight," Louisa simply replied, returning her attention to the toys. The morning of the hearing dawned sunny, in direct contrast to the tension they felt. Edward dressed formally, navy suit, discreet tie, the kind of presentation he used for board meetings. Louisa chose a simple peach-colored dress with a beige blazer, professional but not ostentatious. The twins would be cared for by Denise, Edward's longtime secretary, who had come especially to help. At the courthouse, located downtown, the nervousness became palpable. The room designated for the preliminary hearing was smaller than Edward had imagined, creating an almost claustrophobic atmosphere. Teresa was already present, sitting next to her lawyer. A middle-aged man with a severe appearance, files methodically organized in front of him. She was dressed entirely in black, as if still in deep mourning, although more than a year had passed since the incident. When Edward and Louisa entered, Teresa gave them a sharp look. The message was clear. She considered Louisa's presence in that space an affront. Dr. Helen, Edward's lawyer, quickly approached, leading them to their seats. She was a woman in her 50s, with elegantly bobbed grey hair and shrewd eyes that conveyed competence. "Remember, direct answers, no excessive emotiveness," she instructed in a low voice. "Judge Foster values objectivity and verifiable facts." Judge Marianne Foster's entrance silenced the room. She was a woman of approximately 60, with brown hair streaked with grey pulled back in an austere bun, thin-rimmed glasses, and a neutral expression that revealed no leanings. After the initial formalities, the hearing began with Teresa's lawyer presenting the case. Dr. Paul Mendez was known for his impeccable rhetoric, constructing narratives that blended facts and interpretations almost imperceptibly. "Your Honor, this case essentially concerns the protection of two vulnerable children who lost their mother in traumatic circumstances and whose father, though well-intentioned, has repeatedly demonstrated an inability to provide adequate emotional stability," he began, his grave voice filling the room. "Mrs. Teresa Albright, the maternal grandmother, seeks custody of her granddaughters not out of a desire to interfere with Mr. Morrison's parenting, but out of legitimate concern for the children's psychological well-being." Methodically, the lawyer presented testimonies from previous nannies, medical reports from the first months after the incident, and statements from close family friends who witnessed the most critical period of the twins' withdrawal. Furthermore, Dr. Mendez continued, "Of profound concern is the recent introduction of a stranger into the family unit, Miss Louisa Campbell, initially hired as a temporary nanny, but who quickly established herself in a position of almost maternal authority, despite having no family ties to the children." Edward felt his stomach clench as he heard Louisa described as a stranger. Beside him, she maintained her composure, although her hands were firmly clasped in her lap. When it was Dr. Helen's turn to present the defense, her approach was methodically different, factual, direct, focused on objective evidence of the children's improvement. "Your Honor, the facts are clear. When Miss Campbell began her work with the twins, they were in a state of profound withdrawal. Currently, after 3 months of structured pedagogical intervention, both are speaking, interacting, developing, according to expected parameters for their age. The report from the advocate Vera Miller confirms this positive evolution." Helen then presented short videos showing the twins at different moments over the past few months. The progression was undeniable. From almost catatonic children to animated little ones who ran, played, and called for their father. As for the stability of the family environment, Mr. Morrison has demonstrated extraordinary resilience. He has partially resumed his professional activities, maintaining flexibility to be present in his daughter's routine. He reorganized the home structure to provide adequate stimulation and consistency. Miss Campbell, far from being an intruder, is a qualified professional whose intervention was decisive for the children's current well-being. After the initial presentations by both parties, Judge Foster requested the reading of the advocate's official report. As the clerk read the document, Edward felt his heart race. The text was predominantly positive. It described an organized environment, healthy interactions between adults and children, evident progress in the twins' development. However, a crucial caveat was presented at the end. Despite the evident advances in the emotional state of the minors and the adequacy of the care provided, it remains uncertain whether the current family configuration offers long-term stability. The bond between the parent and the educator lacks formalization that guarantees continuity, representing a potential factor of future instability. Edward felt the weight of those words. The lack of formalization of the arrangement with Louisa could be the weak point Teresa would exploit. Judge Foster then requested Louisa to give her testimony. Under the watchful eye of the court, she walked to the designated chair, maintaining a dignified posture despite her evident nervousness. "Miss Campbell, please describe your professional background and how you came to work for Mr. Morrison," the judge requested. In a calm voice, Louisa recounted her academic background, her experience in New York City, and the circumstances that led her to San Diego. When she reached the part about her brother, her voice choked slightly. Matthew was 18 when he passed away. For 3 years, we fought against a congenital heart condition that only manifested in adolescence. I was all he had and he was my only family. When I lost him, I also lost my compass. Returning to San Diego was an attempt at reconstruction. The sincerity in her voice was palpable, creating a respectful silence in the room. "And how do you assess your role in the lives of the Morrison twins?" the judge asked. "My role is transitional by definition, Your Honor. I am there to help them rebuild trust in the world, to process a loss that is too great for their still developing understandings. I am not, nor do I intend to be, a substitute for their mother. Felicity will always be unique and irreplaceable in their lives." Teresa's lawyer intervened. "If I may, Your Honor. Ms. Campbell, is it true that you abandoned your career as an educator in New York City after suffering an emotional collapse, being dismissed on psychiatric recommendation?" Louisa paled slightly. "I went through a period of intense grief after losing my brother, yes. I received psychological counseling and decided on my own to take a break from working with traumatized children." "So you admit that your own emotional stability has been compromised recently. How can we trust that you will not abandon the Morrison twins when your own traumas resurface?" Dr. Helen immediately protested. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is speculating about the witness's mental health without any technical basis." "Objection sustained," the judge pronounced. "Dr. Mendez, confine yourself to verifiable facts." But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. However, Louisa quickly recovered. "If I may respond, Your Honor, my experience with grief taught me precisely what Sophia and Beatrice need. Someone who understands that pain is not linear, that recovery has ups and downs, that absence is never completely filled, only re-signified. I am not there as someone who has perfectly overcome loss, but as someone who has learned to carry that weight and still find beauty in life." Her words touched everyone present. Even Teresa looked away for a moment, as if struck by an uncomfortable truth. When Edward was called to testify, he felt strangely calm. The months of personal transformation since Louisa's arrival had given him back something he had lost, the certainty of his capacity as a father. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Albright alleges that you deliberately alienated her from her granddaughters. How do you respond to that accusation?" the judge asked. "With all due respect to Teresa's pain, that is not true. After the funeral, she herself said she needed time, that seeing the girls caused her too much suffering. I respected her grieving process. I kept her informed about the children's condition through messages and emails, many of which went unanswered. Edward presented records of communications sent to Teresa in previous months, many without a response. The hearing continued with technical questions about the children's routine, medical follow-up and educational plans. Edward responded with the confidence of someone who intimately knew every aspect of his daughters' lives, not just as a provider, but as an active participant. When it seemed that the hearing was moving towards its conclusion, the courtroom door opened and an assistant handed a document to Teresa's lawyer. After reading it quickly, Dr. Mendez requested permission to introduce a last-minute piece of evidence. "Your Honor, an article has just been published in the Coastal Chronicle about financial problems faced by Mr. Morrison's company. According to internal sources, Quantum Code is reportedly facing significant difficulties after losing an important federal government contract." A murmur went through the room. Edward felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. It was true that an important contract was under renegotiation, but the situation was far from the crisis described by the newspaper. The judge examined the clipping presented. "Mr. Morrison, do you confirm that your company is facing financial difficulties?" "Your Honor, like any technology company, we face constant challenges. We are in the process of renegotiating with some clients, but our financial situation is solid. We have significant reserves and a diversified portfolio." Dr. Mendez pressed. "However, if the federal contract is not renewed, Quantum Code will lose approximately 40% of its annual revenue. How do you intend to maintain your daughter's standard of living in that scenario?" Before Edward could respond, Louisa stood up, an unexpected gesture that surprised everyone in the room. "Your Honor, if I may, regardless of Mr. Morrison's financial situation, which I believe to be much more stable than is being suggested, I would like to state that I am willing to contribute financially to the twins' well-being, if necessary. I recently returned to my profession, accepting a part-time position as a pedagogical consultant at the Pathways Foundation. I have my own means and stability to ensure that Sophia and Beatrice will never be left unprotected. Louisa's gesture, offering her own resources to ensure the children's well-being, created a silence laden with meaning in the room. Teresa watched with an indignant expression, as if that statement confirmed all her suspicions. It was then that Edward, moved by a sudden clarity, did the unexpected. "Your Honor, there is something I need to declare. I didn't plan to do this way, but circumstances demand complete honesty." He took a deep breath, looking first at Louisa and then at the judge. "I intend to ask Miss Campbell to marry me, not just for legal or stability reasons, but because over these months I have discovered in her an extraordinary partner, someone who understands my pain, who genuinely loves my daughters, who brought light back into our lives." Louisa looked at him with absolute astonishment. Teresa let out an exclamation of indignation. Judge Foster maintained her neutral expression, although her eyebrows had risen slightly. "Mr. Morrison, this is a significant declaration that potentially alters the parameters of this case. Considering the impact of this information and the need to evaluate it properly, I order the suspension of this hearing for 7 days. During this period, I expect to receive additional documentation regarding your company's financial stability and a supplementary evaluation from the court's multidisciplinary team. The next session will be on Wednesday, December 15th, at 10 a.m. With a gavel strike, the hearing was adjourned, leaving a trail of almost palpable tension in the air. The return to the apartment after the hearing was marked by a dense silence. Edward's words in the courtroom, his unexpected declaration about marriage, hung between him and Louisa like a physical presence as the elevator ascended to the 10th floor. Denise had taken the twins to the park, giving them space for the inevitable conversation they needed to have. Sitting on the balcony with untouched coffee cups between them, it was Louisa who finally broke the silence. "Why did you say that, Edward?" He ran his hands over his face. A gesture she already knew indicated he was struggling to organize complex thoughts. "It was impulsive, I know, and unfair to you. I shouldn't have made a declaration of that magnitude without us talking first." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "But it wasn't a lie, or a purely legal strategy." Louisa felt her heart quicken but kept her voice calm. "We are friends, Edward. We've developed a strong partnership in caring for the girls. But marriage, that's something much more complex. Do you think I don't know that?" The intensity in his voice surprised them both. "I had a real marriage, Louisa. With Felicity, we had something I believed to be unrepeatable. When I lost her, I also lost the ability to imagine any other relationship." He stood up, approaching the balcony railing, looking out at San Diego Bay bathed in the early afternoon light. "But then you arrived, and it wasn't like in the movies, where someone appears and magically heals all wounds. It was gradual, real. You helped my daughters find their way back, and in the process, without realizing it, you also showed me a way out of the labyrinth I was in." Louisa stood up too, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough for the conversation to retain its intimacy. "I have immense affection for you, Edward, and I love Sophia and Beatrice as if they were mine." She hesitated in her choice of word. "But a marriage based primarily on gratitude or practical necessity—" "It's not just that," he interrupted, turning to face her. "Gratitude was just the beginning. What I feel now is different. It's admiration for your strength, for your heart, for your ability to face your own pain and still offer so much love to my daughters. It's connection, the feeling that you understand me without me needing to explain everything. It's possibility, the perception that perhaps against all odds a new chapter can exist for all of us." Louisa felt tears forming, but she didn't let them fall. So much was at stake, not just her feelings, but the future of 2 children who had already faced too many losses. "We cannot get this wrong, Edward. Sophia and Beatrice need stability, not adults making hasty decisions that could fall apart later." Edward nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "You're right. Completely right. And that's precisely why I trust you, Louisa. Because even at a moment like this, your first thought is the girl's well-being." He smiled slightly, a smile touched by melancholy. Let's do this. I'll retract the statement about the marriage. Dr. Helen can inform the judge that it was a moment of pressure, a reflection of our concern for the twins' future. Louisa considered the suggestion, then shook her head. No, that would only weaken our position. The judge would interpret it as emotional instability, exactly what Teresa is trying to prove. Then what do you suggest? Before Louisa could answer, the intercom rang. Edward answered, his expression changing from surprise to concern. It's Teresa. She's downstairs asking to come up. They exchanged apprehensive glances. What could Teresa want after the confrontation at the hearing? Revenge, negotiation, additional intimidation? Let her up, Louisa decided. Perhaps it's time for an honest conversation, without lawyers or judges mediating. Minutes later, Teresa Albright entered the apartment. To their surprise, she was alone. No lawyer, no assistance. Even more surprising was her appearance. She looked exhausted, with visible dark circles under her eyes, and a fragility that contrasted with the combative image she had projected in court. "Where are my granddaughters?" was her first question, her voice devoid of its usual hostility. "With Denise at the park." "They'll be back soon," Edward replied, indicating the sofa. "Would you like to sit down, Teresa?" She accepted, placing her bag carefully beside her, as if the mundane gesture helped her organize tumultuous thoughts. "I reread the reports," she began, after a moment of uncomfortable silence. "The medical reports, the social workers' evaluations, the advocate's opinion. I read everything, several times during the night, and for the first time since—" She hesitated, as if the word was too painful. "Since we lost Felicity, I realized that perhaps I'm doing everything wrong." The confessional tone surprised Edward and Louisa, who exchanged quick glances before turning their attention back to Teresa. "The girls are doing well, Teresa," Edward said gently. "They're returning to being happy children despite everything." "I know. That's what all the reports say." Teresa looked directly at Louisa for the first time. "That's what you managed to do, isn't it? What all the specialists, all the previous nannies, all the therapists couldn't, you brought them back." There was no accusation in her voice, just a painful realization. "I didn't do it alone," Louisa replied gently. "Edward has been an extraordinary father, present every step of the way, and the girls themselves. They are incredibly resilient." Teresa smiled sadly. "Like their mother." She opened her bag, taking out an envelope. "I didn't come for further confrontations. I came to deliver this personally." Edward took the envelope, opening it cautiously. It was a formal document, signed by Teresa, withdrawing the request for custody of her granddaughters. "I don't understand," he murmured, genuinely confused by the sudden change. Teresa took a deep breath before explaining. "There's another reason why I initiated this process with such urgency. A reason I didn't mention." She paused as if gathering courage. "I was diagnosed with advanced cancer 3 months ago. A guarded prognosis, as the doctors say in their elegant vocabulary for the inevitable. The revelation hit Edward and Louisa like a physical blow. Teresa, We had no idea," Edward stammered. "Of course not. I didn't tell anyone. Not even my lawyer." She adjusted her pearl necklace, an automatic gesture of composure. "When I received the diagnosis, something inside me panicked. I thought, I can't leave without ensuring my granddaughters are well, without leaving something of myself for them, some positive memory. I think deep down, I wanted to be for them what Felicity can't be." Louisa moved silently to the kitchen, returning with a glass of water which she offered to Teresa. The simple gesture of care seemed to touch the older woman, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "What happened in court today?" Teresa continued after a sip. "Your declaration about marriage, Edward, initially infuriated me. It seemed like a final betrayal of Felicity's memory. But then, reviewing everything that was said, all the reports about the girls' progress," she looked at Louisa, "I realized that I am fighting against my own granddaughter's happiness." Tears formed in her eyes, something Edward had never seen in all the years he had known his mother-in-law. "What I want now is simply to be a grandmother, for the time I have left. Not a substitute for their mother, not a legal guardian, just a grandmother. If you allow me." The silence that followed was laden with emotion. It was Louisa who spoke first, her voice gentle. "The girls deserve to know their mother's mother. They deserve all the stories, all the memories you can share about Felicity. Edward, still processing the complexity of the situation, nodded. I never wanted to keep you away from the girls, Teresa. We just needed to find a balance, a path that respected everyone's healing process. Teresa discreetly wiped away a tear. So, if you allow me, I'd like to start over. Not as an adversary, but as part of this family. The word family hung between them, complex, imperfect, still in definition. At that moment, they heard animated voices in the hallway. Denise was returning with the twins. When the door opened, Sophia and Beatrice ran in, their little faces flushed from playing outdoors. They stopped abruptly upon seeing the unfamiliar visitor. "Hello, little ones," Teresa said softly, without attempting an immediate approach. "I'm Grandma Teresa." The twins looked at Edward and Louisa, seeking confirmation that everything was all right. Receiving reassuring smiles, Sophia, always the observer, took a hesitant step towards her grandmother. "Grandma," she repeated, testing the new word. "Yes, dear. I'm your mommy's mommy." Beatrice, encouraged by her sister, also approached, curious. Teresa, with newfound wisdom, didn't attempt hugs or immediate physical contact. She simply smiled, waiting for her granddaughters to establish their own pace of approach. Louisa suggested that Teresa stay for dinner, an invitation that surprised everyone, including herself. During the simple meal, a new dynamic began to form, still fragile but promising. Teresa told small stories about Felicity as a child, stories that made Edward smile in recognition, and the twins listen with fascinated attention. In the weeks that followed, life reorganized itself in unexpected patterns. The judicial case was officially closed after Teresa withdrew her petition. Judge Foster, in her final decision, recommended continued family counseling, but recognized the extraordinary progress in the children's development and well-being under the shared care of their father and educator. Edward and Louisa decided not to rush decisions about their personal relationship. The impulsive declaration about marriage in court remained a future possibility, not an immediate promise. As Edward explained to Dr. Helen, "We are building something real, not a legal solution. That takes time." Teresa, confronting her own mortality with surprising dignity, became a constant, though discreet, presence in her granddaughters' lives. She reorganized her will, leaving her country house in Julian Heights on the outskirts of San Diego to the twins, a place where they can grow with space, nature, and perhaps some apple trees, she explained, recalling Felicity's love for that fruit. As summer progressed, Edward made a significant professional decision. He declined a multi-million-dollar offer from an international conglomerate that wished to acquire Quantum Code. Instead, he restructured the company with a focus on long-term sustainability, transferring much of the operations to a model that allowed him to work predominantly from home. "Priorities have changed," he explained to Raphael, who understood perfectly. "Success now has a different meaning." On a particularly warm February afternoon, while the twins played under Louisa's watchful eye on the balcony, Edward received a visit from Teresa. Her condition had visibly worsened, but she maintained the dignity that had always characterized her. "I came to bring this," she said, handing him a small leather-bound album. "These are photos of Felicity that you may never have seen, from her childhood, her adolescence. I thought that one day the girls would like to know this part of their mother's story." Edward leafed through the album with reverent care, recognizing in the eyes of the child Felicity the same sparkle he saw in his daughters. "Thank you, Teresa. This means a lot." She nodded, watching her granddaughters through the balcony door. "They are so much like her at that age. Especially Beatrice. She has the same restless spirit." Her voice carried a mix of melancholy and acceptance. "Promise me something, Edward. Anything. Promise that, regardless of the path you choose, you, Louisa, the girls, you will always take care of each other. That you will never let the fear of loss prevent you from living fully." The depth of the request revealed how much Teresa had changed in recent months. "I promise," Edward replied, understanding the true meaning behind those words. In early March, Teresa passed away peacefully, surrounded by a reconstituted family that even she herself could not have imagined months earlier. Her final request was for no formal ceremonies, just a small gathering at the country house she loved so much. It was there, among the verdant hills of Julian Heights, that Edward, Louisa, and the twins found themselves a few weeks later, contemplating the next chapter of their lives. The spacious and welcoming wooden house, overlooking a small apple orchard planted by Felicity years earlier, seemed to offer them a new beginning. "What do you think?" Edward asked Louisa, as they watched the twins running among the trees, their laughter echoing across the property. "It's perfect," she replied, her eyes absorbing the simple beauty of the place. A space to grow, to heal, to build new memories without erasing the old ones. Edward gently took her hand. "I think it's time for that conversation we've postponed since the hearing." Louisa smiled, lightly squeezing his fingers. "About?" "About us. About family. About what we want to build together." Sitting on the rustic porch of the house, with the mountains in the background and the sound of the girls' laughter as a soundtrack, they finally allowed themselves the conversation they feared and desired in equal measure. "I don't want to replace Felicity," Louisa began, expressing her deepest fear. "Neither for you nor for the girls." "No one ever could," Edward replied simply. "Just as I know no one could replace your brother in your heart. It's not about replacement, Louisa. It's about expansion, of hearts that grow to accommodate new loves without diminishing the previous ones." She nodded, understanding profoundly. The girls will always know who their mother was. They will have photos, stories, memories shared by you, by Teresa, by everyone who loved her. "And they will have you," Edward added, "not as a substitute, but as a second chance at maternal love that destiny, in its complexity, brought into their lives." Louisa took a deep breath, looking at the horizon where the sun began to set behind the mountains. "So, what exactly are you proposing, Edward Morrison?" He smiled, recognizing the lightness she brought to such a significant moment. "I'm proposing that we continue this journey together, officially if you accept. Not for legal convenience, not out of gratitude, but because we found in the ashes of immense losses something rare and precious." "And what would you call that something?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Some would call it a miracle, others a coincidence. I prefer to call it simply love, imperfect, unexpected, but profoundly real." At that moment the twins came running, carrying small, still green apples they had found under the trees. Beatrice, always the more talkative now, exclaimed, "Mommy Lulu, Dada, look what we found." The word mommy had come out naturally, without rehearsal or preparation. Louisa felt tears in her eyes as she embraced the little ones. "They are special apples," she explained, her voice choked with emotion. "From the tree your mommy planted. A gift from her to you." Sophia, the silent observer, extended her small hand to wipe a tear that ran down Louisa's face. "Don't cry, Mommy Lulu. It's all good now." Edward enveloped the three in a hug, forming a circle of protection and belonging. The sun slowly set, bathing the orchard in golden tones, while inside the newly inherited house, old and new photographs coexisted in harmony. Felicity smiling at her graduation, young Teresa holding her newborn daughter, the twins in their first steps, Edward and Louisa in recent small celebrations. In the autumn of that same year, a simple ceremony was held in the house's garden. Only close friends, Cecilia and Anthony, Edward's parents, a few colleagues from Quantum Code, and at the center of it all, two little flower girls who scattered petals with disorganized enthusiasm. When Beatrice woke up startled that night, after a confused nightmare about people disappearing, it was Edward who got up, holding her securely in his arms. "It's okay, my love," he whispered, rocking her gently. "We're all here. No one will disappear. Promise, Dada?" she asked, her little eyes seeking certainty in her father's face. "I promise. We're home now. All of us." Outside, the autumn wind gently swayed the apple trees, and inside the wooden house that held so many intertwined stories, a family born of pain had finally found its way to peace. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Edward and Louisa's story has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we have prepared a special playlist with equally engaging narratives about new beginnings and second chances. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this story of overcoming and reborn love moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Daily, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human feelings and our extraordinary ability to rebuild our lives after great losses. Share your own experiences of new beginnings in the comments. We look forward to hearing them.